It's not a brand new world, it's a new brand world. Looks quite simply to look around what we've been up to around cultural impact and the velocity of brands, and importantly, how in our fast-changing world, we need new measures to not just keep up, but try and get ahead of consumers, that we can link it to tangible business results. So some things that we know. Hopefully I'll get you nodding from the off. Advertising avoidance behaviors will continue to accelerate as there are new platforms and new technologies that as they're embraced and emerged. We touch on ad blockers. We have people falling into lakes in shopping malls because of their attention deficit disorder and looking at their phones. We know that that's going to continue. A direct consequence of that is obviously the continued deterioration of paid media's effectiveness over time. It's not that paid media isn't still a massive part of what we do moving forward. It absolutely is. Anybody that's ever heard me speak over the last 20-odd years, whenever anybody else has said TV's dead, I generally sneer at the back and shout out, I'm a massive fan of TV. I still watch about 4 hours of TV pretty much every day, much to my wife's annoyance. She reads books, I love TV. We're just wired in a different way. But we know that technology is impacting the overall effectiveness of paid media, as well as changes in demography, which we'll touch on later. As Matt said, at Initiative, we believe that media, rather than simply being a delivery vehicle for advertising messages, can contribute to something much bigger, and that's being part of culture. And that culture itself is a quantifiable connector of brands and people, and hopefully, and as we'll touch on through this presentation, business growth. I've always believed clients do not spend money. We do not spend money on behalf of clients. It's an investment, and anybody looking through a financial lens, it is always about a risk horizon, a return horizon, and how we're going to maximize the return on that investment. Matt also said that there's huge opportunity for brands that can transform from, I suppose, being forgettable and regrettable content interrupters, but also how they can change into being cultural contributors and curators and creators of content too. I also think that standing here in Singapore, representing APAC to a room full of people largely from the APAC region, that this is true nowhere more in the world than right here in Asia. So if this is our belief, which it is, the speed of change means that a lot of the existing brand equity measures are becoming outdated because they simply can't keep up. That the brands that are valuable today aren't necessarily going to be valuable tomorrow, and some of those brands that we never heard of 5 years ago are actually now more valuable than many of those that we grew up with that have been around for decades. We always use Uber as an example. Given one of the Taco Bell examples that Chad just put up, I want to talk about Snapchat. It's literally 5 years ago last week that the app launching Snapchat launched. And as of about 10 o'clock last night, unless there was a stock market crash, it was worth about $18 billion within a 5-year period. So it's no longer enough that a brand that was once strong or has simply performed well in the past will be seen as successful in the future. A lot of the standard indicators that we still use are less likely to be the drivers and the predictors of their future success. So we believe that we need new indicators that capture how agile brands are, how responsive they are to consumer needs, and the changing market conditions around them, and in large part, the degree to which they can create and capitalize upon innovative new products and services. So, to fill the need, at Initiative, we look to develop a new world measure called the Cultural Velocity Index. I prefer to call it CVI for short. As Matt mentioned, after extensive study and research in partnership with Jonah Berger, professor at Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, we've worked to define that cultural velocity is the speed at which a brand interprets, responds to the cultural data signals to improve its relevance with consumers and drive incremental business growth. We'll spend a little bit of time on the methodology, but here in Asia, we beta tested it last year in 2 markets, them being India and China. But off the back of that success and lobbying global for a lot more investment, we scaled it, invested in it to ensure that we were looking to cover certainly most of the major markets across Asia and certainly our major markets at IPG Mediabrands. because as we all know in this room, one size does not fit all across Asia. I'm going to quickly throw to Jonah, who as chief architect helped design a lot of the thinking behind this in conjunction with Matt and the team at Initiative to describe the project in his words.
The business landscape has changed. It used to be that being a large company or having good brand equity was a key to success. But the challenge today is there's a lot of disruption. The big brands that were once great today aren't necessarily great tomorrow, and small upstarts are taking their place really quickly. It's not enough to know that a brand was good. The question is, where's that brand going? And that's why we put together the Cultural Velocity Index. Understanding what makes some brands better and easier, more likely to change in the future, and what makes them more likely to be successful. And so we surveyed thousands of brands and tens of thousands of customers over dozens of countries to understand what made these brands more velocity, what made them have more velocity, and what makes them more likely to succeed. We found that there are 4 key dimensions to study when we're looking at cultural velocity, and those are innovativeness, how much companies make new brands and products; responsiveness, how much they respond to their consumers and the cultural conversation that's out there; agility, how they move and are agile based on the winds of change that come in the marketplace; and finally, sociability. We all recognize the power of word of mouth and how large and engaged these brands' both social media presence is, as well as offline. And what we found looking across all this data, all these countries, and all these brands is that this idea of change, this idea of velocity, is really important when understanding brand success. Brands that have higher cultural velocity, that's not just a nice metric, those brands actually perform better in the market. 61% better quarter-on-quarter revenue growth for brands that are higher on cultural velocity. And so we're really trying to understand this change and use this change to predict where brands are going in the future. Whether these brands are going to be successful not only today, but also whether they're going to be successful tomorrow. And so now we'll go to Lee in Mumbrella 360 for more about the results.
Thank you, Jonah. Yes, well done. Look, he's clearly a very, very smart guy, and the fact that we've been working with him for over 2 years specifically on this project. Again, bit of a plug for him. For those of you that haven't read Contagious, his book, a lot of the thinking around how brands interact in social and how social trends spread certainly informed some of our thinking. He worked alongside our team and we determined the key dimensions that he touched on that determine the shape of a brand's cultural velocity. We looked at all the other academic literature that's out there on branding, including the dimensions of brand personality. I'll give somebody a nerd off and bore them later with all the other stuff that was included within it. But essentially the dimensions tap different aspects of the cultural velocity, and whilst being conceptually distinct in and of themselves, it means that some brands do well on one aspect, but not necessarily on another. The score itself is calculated by assessing brands across each of the 4 and equally weighted dimensions of innovation, agility, responsiveness, and sociability. I think one of the things that would be naive, nay, stupid for me to say is that this is a study that is now set in stone for the future. I think as we continually see change in the way in which brands communicate, the way in which consumers respond to brands, we can't sit still. And we've already discussed how we look to ensure that this stays culturally relevant today, because in 2, 3, 5 years' time, that's not necessarily going to be the same methodology that we're currently using. So we're fully expecting that these measures will have to adjust over time, but it is these 4 right here, right now. Now, in terms of the results, not only do they help brands start to stack up and see how they stack up relative to their competitive set, but also start to identify some geographic regions and dimensions where there is potential room for improvement. The tool is designed to be exactly that, a diagnostic tool that gives you a score, and we all know human nature is to compare. As soon as you know a score, you want to know who's below you, who's above you, and what you can do to improve it, and it is designed very specifically for that. Brands index highly when consumers perceive them as innovative, agile, and responsive, and where they leverage technologies, create novel products and services, and adapt to changing market conditions. I think importantly, and it's something that we all try and do, I know I've got many customers in the room, how brands, be they B2B businesses such as ours or B2C, how they listen and respond to consumer needs in timely fashion. And just thinking back to Matt's presentation earlier when we were talking about Kendall Jenner and Pepsi, it's not necessarily that in a fast-moving world, brands can't make mistakes. I think customers are more than accepting of brands that make mistakes, so long as they're quick to respond when they have, they do a mea culpa, and they tell people what they're going to do about it. I think as we look to develop our businesses around agile and nimble and being faster, we have to ensure that that mea culpa aspect is built into our forward planning. I can't stress this enough, that Joan has mentioned it, Matt said it, so you've got a frequency of 3 here, that there is a distinct relationship between the brand's cultural velocity index score and its future momentum and its revenue growth. Jonah mentioned the number. What we're seeing is that on average there is a 61% higher revenue growth for those businesses and brands that have got a higher CVI score. There's the 61%. For the APAC ranking, just before we unveil it, we applied a weighting to both GDP and population to come up with a final APAC ranking based on the individual local market results. So consequently, China, Japan, and India have a greater impact on the holistic APAC results. Also importantly, we only included brands that had over 50% familiarity across the weighted figures. So whilst there are some anomalies within the local results, we've looked to ensure that some strange and wonderful businesses as a result of anomalies aren't there. So drum roll, please. There. Thank you, Jacob. The results. Matt alluded to it earlier. I don't think it is any surprise that some of the global tech players that you would expect to have a high cultural velocity, it's no surprise that they're there. The huge impact that they have on our daily lives, their frequency of use, their immediacy, the fact that they're in your hands or on your watch, and their genuine utility. The fact that they're continually striving to entrench themselves even further into our everyday lives. I don't think it's any surprise that at an APAC level, the top 5 are what they are. I think it starts to get more interesting when you start to look in the lower half of the top 20, where you're certainly starting to see some stronger China brands coming through. Is this really buzzy and annoying? It's because of that thing? There we go. Well, I can just stand over there. Is that less buzzy? Sorry if I've been annoying the hell out of everybody, other than what I've been saying for the last 10 minutes. But yeah, it starts to get more interesting when we start to see some of the China brands, the Huawei's, Xiaomi, and Lenovo coming into it. But also, it's not just about technology. Right down at number 20, we have QSR in KFC. What's interesting when we start to pull apart the data, not surprising that Apple, Google, and Facebook dominate pretty much across most of the markets, with the exception of South Korea. I think any South Koreans in the room would be not surprised to see that Samsung is top from a local perspective. But if you start to pull it apart from a North Asia perspective, it seems to be that there's the mobile technology giants dominating North Asia, whilst it's more the social platforms that are prevalent in the more developing nations. Given that we're here in Singapore, looking not so much at the holistic APAC number, whilst interesting, it's much more relevant when you look at the individual impact within local brands. So again, not surprisingly, although slightly different ordering of the technology brands. But again, you can start to see local businesses and local brands coming through. So the fact that Changi's there, if you're going to get stuck in one airport in the world, I'd suggest it's Changi because it's pretty much the best one. We've obviously got the local airline, but also we've got FairPrice and Singtel. So again, it's a smattering of not just the technology brands. It's actually a wonderful combination of brands that cover many of the categories from technology to retail, as well as to services and media. So not just tech. When we start to look at which of those key indicators by market or key drivers by market, it starts to show how wonderfully diverse APAC really is. So what we found, or I found quite interesting, was that the more westernized developed nations, the Australias, the New Zealands, and Malaysia, had a much stronger score for innovation. Developing nations, so a lot of the Southeast Asia markets, much more affinity towards sociability in their brands. Some of the more fast-paced markets, such as Hong Kong and Japan, felt that agility is much more important in a brand, whereas perhaps culturally more cautiously traditional markets, such as South Korea and Taiwan, viewed responsiveness as much more key for them. Anybody that is a researcher, and I'm not a researcher by background, I'm just a nerd that enjoys going into the detail of this stuff and working with our research teams on it. But anybody that is a hardcore researcher knows that the way in which different markets complete research, they do it in different ways. So what we look to do is try and take account of that. So what you see in some more developing markets who are, as a general rule, more generous in their scoring, whereas some of the more developed markets, possibly more demanding, more skeptical in their responses, and that's obviously just a bit of a nuance in research. But what we found was that across all of the different categories, that pretty much the same shape, whether it's categories as diverse as luxury cars or QSRs, that pretty much follows the same shape. And we looked at it across all the different categories, apart from there's a bit of a blip in the Philippines because with Jollibees, with Macca's, and with KFC, Filipinos do love their QSRs and fast food. What we've been able to do is look at the categories as well. So it's no surprise that in terms of the vertical differences, that the strongest CVI scores are in computer technology, space agency, but some of the ones with the higher sociability scores, such as travel, luxury, and even FMCG, whilst at an aggregate level slightly behind on the curve in terms of their cultural velocity, can still move the needle. And again, I think each market, each vertical, and therefore obviously even the same brand across different markets, it starts to show the genuine nuances and the rich tapestry of the different cultures across Asia. We've touched on the macro level results, but as I've just said, there's no such thing as the United States of Asia. So let's deep dive into some brands in local markets to see how different categories perform and how brands are perceived and can react to some of this. So if we start with BMW in Indonesia. Anybody from Indonesia in the room? Excellent. So looking at Indonesia, we all know it's a massively growing market. No more so than when it comes to car manufacturing and sales. There's a lot of the. I'm going to stand. I'm going to sit down for a minute because this thing's starting to annoy me, hearing all the buzzing in my background. Can't get rid of that. Okay. Hey, I'm paying for the stage. I can do what I like. So looking at Indonesia, car manufacturing and car sales, it's the highest, massively growing, highest sales in the ASEAN region, but high taxes on luxury cars makes it much harder for global high-end brands to really cut through. So if we look at cars, here are the different brands that we looked at across Indonesia, and what you can see is that BMW scored just over 5, good strong score. But what's really interesting is out of the 7 car brands, it scored the highest on sociability, something you wouldn't always necessarily associate with a car brand. I think Ferrari is probably a bit unique in the fact that Ferrari as a brand, as well as whether it's Formula One, whether it's Michael Schumacher, all of the things that you associate with the Ferrari brand give it a community and a sociability that many of the other car brands wouldn't necessarily have. Equally, at the same time, innovation is highly important for the overall category. So combining the two to help BMW launch its 7 Series was a significant challenge. One of the things that we were able to do, because BMW is a client of ours in Indonesia, is that given that the target audience of senior level CEOs, many of whom in Indonesia have the privilege of a chauffeur, the overall target audience of the Indonesian population for this was 0.04. So it's highly targeted, Chad. So how could we speak with an elusive target audience through the lens of sociability and innovation dimensions, as put through the CVI, when we know that they're time poor, barely look at social media? Hopefully everybody can read that at the back rather than me reading it out. But essentially, we tapped into a moment, or what we believe to be the moment when they are most receptive and have downtime, which was at the end of a business lunch. We partnered with 5-star restaurants and hotels to deliver essentially a BMW test drive invite via tablet, which was delivered to their table at the same time that they were looking to pay the bill. Again, I think its simplicity and its targeted nature. Again, it was award-winning, but it was using the insights to genuinely drive a media moment. But it resulted in significant increase in sales. For anybody that's ever worked in car business, in terms of leads to sales, you're generally looking at something like 1 in 4. This was close to 6 out of 10 in terms of conversion through to purchase, and significant increase in future leads, not just for the 7 Series, but other models as well. So the CVI absolutely helped understand the audience, as well as driving a very solid business result to a very discrete audience. I suppose the key takeout for other brands is that you often need to look beyond the category expectations and norms and actually create some new channels of communication, which this one absolutely was. Whizzing our way from Jakarta to Kuala Lumpur, very different category, different country. In diverse countries such as Malaysia with very different food preferences, there's obviously immense competition in the QSR category, and it's all about market share. And whilst KFC does rank high in the CVI, both at a local as well as an APAC level, which we touched on earlier, they found it hard to cut through in the burger category, because we all know, right, that KFC is finger-licking good, and it's about the chicken, not necessarily about the burgers. But what we do know is that it scored very highly within the CVI around sociability and has a very strong association with being responsive in the Malaysian consumer mindset. So how did we match the CVI data to the insights and ultimately drive a campaign? Sorry, there's the data. One of the challenges with this, before we get into what we actually did, was the fact that KFC doesn't always resonate strongly with millennials. However, understanding that sociability being a key dimension for KFC, we were able to come up with a very different type of communication that allowed us to launch the new hot and cheesy burger for KFC. We developed over 100 different creative vignettes that were tailor-made to what people had been watching on YouTube and via programmatic and addressable content, so that we were able to deliver the right message to the right person. The 100 vignettes used humor, and again, it's all on YouTube, so please have a look, as a way to connect sociably and on target with the millennial audience. The results speak for themselves. 16% increase week on week is huge in QSR. The digital metrics in terms of the view-throughs were huge, and the organic views versus our benchmarks were a 400% difference. So again, a key takeout for other brands: don't underestimate the power of how understanding the core cultural dimensions, coupled with creative technology, can genuinely drive sales. Last couple of examples. We mentioned earlier that last year we started the journey with CVI in India and in China. So let's look at a couple of brands that have looked to increase their ranking year on year and start to see why their cultural velocity may have improved. So if we click through that one, because that should have been deleted. There we go. If we look at Xiaomi, just a quick brief history. In 2014, it was looking like a Chinese miracle. Smartphone sales of 60 million units, valued at $45 billion. However, brand loyalty is fickle, and certainly in China's very fiercely competitive smartphone market. Domestic rivals Huawei, Oppo, Vivo soon surpassed them in terms of smartphone sales. And early last year, some of the tech and entertainment analysts were actually flagging concerns about the company's overall decline. The CEO went on record admitting that selling cheap phones online simply isn't enough, and that the company will have to focus on innovative technologies and products that speak for themselves, and look to break through into the high-end smartphone market. The company also beefed up its offline retail presence, more than tripling the number of its My Home stores, its bricks and mortar stores. So again, I think what you'll see with the CVI, it's not just a media tool, it's not just a communications tool, it's everything to do with the brand's exposure and experience and how customers see the brand at its widest possible level. So it's a wider business diagnostic tool rather than simply how we can plan and buy media better. That to me is one of its core focuses from an initiative perspective, but how brands can work with it is simply wider than that. So in 2016, Xiaomi's CVI was 18th. It was 4th in the marketplace when it came to smartphone sales, and very much relied on affordable smartphones for the masses that predominantly sold online. But by 2017, it had moved significantly up the CVI rankings. So I think wider than simply media, the change in business strategy meant it became much more culturally relevant across the agile and sociable dimensions in the market. I think coupled with very strong global shipments, as well as domestic sales, it's now put them ahead of Apple in terms of sales in the China marketplace. Through understanding that the consumer wanted more affordable smartphones sold online only, has allowed them to creep up the rankings, but by investing in retail and moving into the higher price point, has looked to move their overall brand proposition both locally and globally. Similar category, different market. And again, looking wider than physically changing what product and what category you're in. If you look at Apple, which was always designed in Cupertino, but largely assembled elsewhere, more often than not China, that Apple recently began assembling the iPhone SE model in India. Essentially a move that could hopefully eventually lead to the availability of lower cost iPhone models in the country. So Tim Cook said that they're bringing all their energies to bear in India. It's the first time that Apple had began to locally manufacture in India. He said that he was not just pleased with the production side of things, but the app accelerator that also opened in India. So this is much more around investing in a market with your overall business and the impact that that then has on how the locals look at your brand. He said that, so Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, said he continues to be very bullish and optimistic about India and will continue to invest in the country. In 2016, they were 46th on the ranking, but by 2017, and it's very, very public in Indian news and the business community about Apple doubling down and very much investing in India. So it's enjoyed a huge jump in the score around its sociability. Now ranks 5th out of the 14 markets that we looked at across APAC, which contributed 10% of its score in 2016, but now is 24%. Again, Tim Cook said the talent in India is incredible. They're expanding their relationships. They're certainly introducing more universities and partners to their platforms as they look to scale their operations. And I think Apple being entrenched within India will absolutely pay dividends for them as a brand and how the customer base will view them. So through embracing local culture, building sociability into the marketplace, it's embraced the warmth of the Indian population for long-term business success. And again, 20% increase in their Indian sales in Q1. So, last thoughts. Today's fast-paced, socially connected marketplace, it's not just about building a product and promoting it. Matt said earlier about the importance of brands. I remember when I first started in the industry, Al Ries and Al Ries's book, the definition of a brand was a product plus a personality. I think that was a simplistic definition for a more simplistic media and marketing age, certainly pre-digital. Well, I think when I first started, digital was a CD-ROM. But the fact that a brand is now built upon every single customer engagement, be that a call center, be that walking past a poster site, be that engaging with them on a mobile phone, I think the way in which we need to look at how consumers are measuring brands through the 4 dimensions that we touched on earlier will intrinsically change the way in which we view how we need to communicate with them. Again, Matt mentioned earlier, a lot of this thinking is now built into the customer velocity planning approach that Initiative are taking. But we have those 4 dimensions very much serving as the underpinnings for brand vitality and future growth. I'm just going to finish with a few final words from my partner in crime, Jonah.
So this is the key question, right? For brands that are successful in terms of cultural velocity, that's great, that's exciting, but most brands have at least one dimension, one area they can improve. And so what should they focus on and how should they do that? And that's the really exciting part. And working with your agency partners, I think you can really understand both the index and what you can do about it. And I would say, don't just look at those high-level scores, where you are on the velocity index as a whole, but drill down a little bit deeper to understand which dimensions you can improve on and which dimensions you're good at the moment. Some brands, for example, may be great on innovativeness, highly innovative, really innovative products and services, not maybe so good at listening to their customers or consumers. Apple and Uber are some examples of brands that are really thought of as doing innovative things, but don't always listen to their customers at the end of the day. And so, first of all, if the challenge is innovativeness, it's about doing more market research and understanding how to generate those innovative products and services. If it's more about responsiveness, though, it's really about putting the customer in the center. Too often, brands or organizations are product or service focused rather than customer focused. They think a lot about what they're good at and not so good or not so much about what the customer or the consumer needs at the end of the day. Really putting that consumer in the center and understanding their needs, their desires, their wants, and their motivations, and building products and services that hit those needs. Other brands may be great on innovativeness and great on responsiveness, but not so good on sociability. And there the question is, what will get people talking and sharing? How can we generate more word of mouth both online and off? And this is something I've worked with lots of companies and organizations about, and something that Contagious talks quite a bit about. Those 6 key steps to boosting word of mouth and causing people to talk and share. And don't only think about online. Often we focus on social media. Social media is a great channel through which word of mouth flows, but a great portion of word of mouth is also offline. And so we think online as well as off. And really focusing again on which dimensions you're good at and which you're not will help you be more successful at the end of the day. Each brand has opportunities to improve, and I think this is a great index and will help every brand move forward and help them become better at cultural velocity and more successful overall.
Just to wrap, I don't think it is rocket science to say that brands need to be customer focused rather than solely product focused. But I do think having a diagnostic tool that allows you to compare, to have a score, to try and better a score for anybody that's a runner or does weights, it's always about how much you can bench press, what was your fastest PB, about continual improvement. And certainly one of my favorite business books, because it's not really the most interesting read, but Andy Groves, the former CEO of Intel, wrote a book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And I'm paranoid. It had me at the title. But I think healthy paranoia is a great thing for all of us to have, or a restlessness. And I think for anybody in the room that is a brand marketer, or even within agencies, because we're brand marketers of our own business, that we should never be satisfied with where we currently are. And if we have diagnostic tools that allow us not just to compare for ourselves, but also to take within our own businesses and start to show your C-suite how the overall business leadership leads from the top. And if it is not being bought into at the very top of an organization as to how innovation, sociability, responsiveness, and agility absolutely translates into a business result, not just from a communications perspective, but in terms of every aspect of how customers look at your business,